Welcome to New Books in Language. Today I'm talking to Professor Elly van Gelderen of Arizona State University about her book, The Linguistic Cycle, Language Change and the Language Faculty. The book is a catalogue of examples of linguistic history repeating itself, but also an attempt to understand the processes that we see within a minimalist syntactic framework, where economy on the part of the language acquirer is crucial for language change. In this interview, among other things, we discuss the notion of the linguistic cycle, the relationship between historical linguistics and syntactic theory, the polysynthetic languages of the Americas, and whether Old English can be classified as polysynthetic. I'm talking to Professor Elly van Gelderen about her book, The Linguistic Cycle, Language Change and the Language Faculty. Elly, there's been plenty of change in your own career. Could you tell us a bit about it, where you started and where you are at the moment?
So it depends on where you think a career starts. And let's say let's arbitrarily started somewhere with my bachelor's, and that was in Utrecht. And I think I ended up in an English department because I was really interested in literature. And it happened to be English, but it could have been German or Dutch or something else. But fortunate in some sense, fortunate for me, and it was in English. And at that time, it was a phonetics-heavy department in Utrecht, but there was a lot of stuff happening. And I remember in my first year taking a class in the history of English, and I just was transformed by that and ended up really enjoying historical linguistics from then on. And it was fortunate that in my fourth year, I think, David Lightfoot joined the department, so that just gave a lot of extra impetus to historical linguistics, but people like Andy Baxter and other people were also very influential. Then after that, I ended up going to McGill, and there was really no historical linguistics there. And so I did mainly syntax. And McGill had a slightly unfortunate history in its personnel, and so I saw people, 3 syntacticians not get tenure, and then 1 stayed. So it was a bit of a rocky start there, but I learned a lot about syntax at McGill. So that's sort of my early start, and then what else would you like me to focus on a bit?
So now you're at Arizona, right?
Mm-hmm.
And from getting interested in historical linguistics at Utrecht, since then you've written a book on the history of English, among other things, a textbook. How did that later stage of your career develop?
So in 1993, I wrote a book on the rise of functional categories, basically looking at how languages differ into the inventory of functional categories that they have. And functional categories are things like complementizers and auxiliaries and demonstratives. And that fascinated me because ultimately that concerns the typology of all languages. So any language in the world needs to be classified. And I'm fascinated by how Native American languages, for instance, have such a morphology-heavy structure. So basically they're a stem, they're a verb, and then they have prefixes or suffixes. And English is not that way. And so that's one of my, I think the thing that keeps me going in terms of what is the big picture. And then of course the other question is, how do children perpetuate a particular language type, and how do they actively change it? And that's another area that I'm really interested in. So from the book in 93 on functional categories, I also became interested in agreement, how verbs agree with their subjects. Then after that, I looked a little bit at pronouns a lot more in the 2000 book. And then after that, I wrote a book on grammaticalization and economy. And grammaticalization is a process where full verbs such as want, for instance, end up being used as future markers or intension markers. And so I worked a lot on grammaticalization and tried to come up with an account for that in terms of a Chomskyan approach, sort of modern syntactic approach. And the way I looked at it is that grammaticalization, I think, is unidirectional. It's always going in one direction. There are a few counterexamples to this, like to up, where a preposition ends up being used as a verb. But there are not so many. So I then started thinking about that in terms of a child learning a language and economizing, thinking, oh, I already have a preposition, I might as well use that as a complementizer as well. And that's what happened in the history of English with for, the preposition for. Originally it was a spatial preposition in front of me, and then of course probably French pushed that out by now we use in front of. Then for is also used as for 5 minutes, for a little bit of time, so temporal. Then it ended up as a benefit for you, and now we're using it as a complementizer. I want very much for you to do that, especially in American English, that for. In British, the purpose one. In British English, you use it as a cause marker. I left, for, he arrived, or something like that.
Okay, so grammaticalization is something that feeds in very crucially to your account of the linguistic cycle in this book. Could you say a little bit about what the linguistic cycle is and how this particular book came about?
Okay, so grammaticalization is one part of a change that is going in one direction, but it's basically economy. So it means that a full verb will lose some semantic features and ends up being used in a grammatical way. But ultimately, that verb may disappear. And that means we also need renewal. And that was the old insight of von der Gabelens in 1901 and Jespersen and various other people, that there's a balance between ease of articulation and grammaticalization and what is sometimes called the comfort principle, and a need for renewal of the bleached elements, and that then is the cycle. So I can give a little bit more an example, the example that's often given of the negative cycle, where in Old English we have a negative by itself, a ne, or a no, or na, and then at some point the verb gets together with this ne and ends up, for instance, not is would be nis and not was would be nas. And because the ne is perhaps not so prominent anymore, native speakers end up using another negative in that sentence. So they would say not is, nis, and then they would say na thing, no thing. And then at some point the no thing ends up being shortened to not and ends up becoming the primary negator. And at that point, the ne can fall off the verb, and that's what happens. Now, of course, the next step in that cycle would be the not ending up as not, which it has. I can't, I don't. You often don't hear whether someone is saying do not or do. So the normal thing would be for it to be renewed as it is in non-standard varieties. I don't see nothing, but prescriptively that's not possible. And now you often hear people use never instead of not. So that's a little bit of the cycle. That's one example of the cycle.
You alluded earlier on to the fact that you're using a Chomskyan approach, specifically a minimalist approach. And to people who aren't familiar with this type of approach, that may seem a bit surprising, because one of the preconceptions people have about minimalism, isn't it all just about what's universal, about similarities between languages? Does it have anything to say? Does it have things to say about the history of languages, about diversity in languages?
I think it obviously does. I think so. There are a number in early minimalism. We're still really focusing on trees. We're focusing on movement. And you can think of economy, so a way of, a child has to interpret the language it hears around its, her or him. I'll just refer to a child as she or he, but so a child needs to interpret what it hears, and then what happens is that it may say, this is too complicated for me, or I see a full phrase, but I can make that into a smaller part, and that is a head. So in early minimalism, you can formulate an economy principle in terms of structure in the tree. And so, for instance, if you want to say the nice person, instead of doing that, you could make it into a pronoun, and that's economizing. One of the other, in later minimalism, to some extent, features become a lot more important. And then the question is, and that's occupied me the last couple of years, what are the universal features? Chomsky, in some of his early works, talks about a universal set of atoms. And with features, I mean things like, how does the child know there is such a thing as negation? Negation is not something you get out of the data tell you. How does the child know there is something like a conditional? If I do this, then that. So at the moment, and Chomsky doesn't talk very much about this, but it is implicit in all of his work, is that we are born with a set of these features and we just fill in. Once we have features like concrete, abstract, when we have these features and we then can learn words, because children learn about 10 words a day, and that can't just be from experience. So the Chomskyan framework is very much a rationalist and non-empiricist framework, and so that then helps you explain what's often called Plato's problem. How do we know so much given that we have so little data available to us?
So something else that's very central to your account of the linguistic cycle is a particular implementation of minimalist theory about features, specifically the idea of feature economy. Could you tell us a little bit about feature economy?
Yes. So, for instance, let's think of the verb will, which in Old English had a different meaning. It was much more a volitional meaning. I really want to go. So originally, a verb like will can have a semantic feature like volition, intention, perhaps prearrangement, but also future. It's something that will happen in the future. And as will changes, so an Old English child had those features connected to will. Then that child also started using it perhaps just as volition, as in I want to go, or just as in future. And so saw that it could just use it in a grammatical way. And so originally the word will be in the lexicon with a lot of features, but the child can use it in a different combination. And then at some point that will be taken over. And so yes, I've been working a lot on, in minimalism there are two types of features, actually many types. There's phonological features, but we won't talk about that very much. There are the semantic features, and I think those are the innate features. And perhaps they're even pre-human. And then there are grammatical features, and they come in two types, interpretable and uninterpretable. And there's been a lot of theorizing about these. And the interpretable ones are the ones that actually have meaning. The uninterpretable ones are just grammatical, and they're fluff to some extent. They aren't necessary, and they might just be there because of historical accident. And to give an example of uninterpretable and interpretable features, let's say in a sentence you have a bunch of negatives, but they all mean one negation. So if I said in English, I don't see nothing, and I meant by that, I don't see anything, then I would only have one interpretable negative feature in that sentence. The other ones would just be agreeing features, and those are the uninterpretable ones. And the same is true with, so another cycle I've worked on is the subject to agreement cycle. So in many languages, subject pronouns end up being agreement markers, inflection on the verb. And the way that you can think about that is that languages in one sentence need to know who is doing what to whom. So you need at least one set of interpretable features telling you who is the actor or who is the subject. Those are two slightly different things, but I'll equate them here. So we need to know who is arriving, for instance, and that those will be interpretable features. But they could be on the verb or on the pronoun. If they're on the pronoun, that's perfectly fine. Then they can be repeated on the verb as well as uninterpretable features. In some languages where you don't need pronouns, it is possible that the interpretable features are sitting on the verb. I don't know if that helped a little bit with interpretable and uninterpretable.
Yeah, so the key change, the unidirectional part of the cycle here, is the change from semantic to interpretable to uninterpretable, essentially.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And on a slightly different note, one thing that one notices when looking at the minimalist syntactic literature is that monographs are often written on very specific, narrow topics, on a particular focus construction in a particular language, for instance. And on reading this book, one immediately notices that it couldn't be more different. There are 40 pages of references, nearly 300 different language varieties in the index and language families, and over 1,000 example sentences. And I just wondered how it played out for you, having to reconcile the great empirical coverage with the kind of detailed coverage that's normal in a minimalist syntactic analysis. How did you find that there was a tension there?
Well, the main tension is you can't look at everything. And it's, for instance, some of the pages on Zapotec, they took me weeks and weeks before I understood the data. And, because that's not my area. And that's true with a number of these areas. So it is, yes, it is hard, but my main emphasis is trying to find examples of the cycle and also of these features. And therefore, it is nice to have as broad a coverage as one can. And I'm not a typologist, so I don't know 300 languages well, and they're not well balanced. The languages that are represented in the book are some of the ones I have some knowledge about, and that's a limitation to some extent. Earlier, you asked about my career, and when I came to Arizona in 1995, one of the things I really wanted to do is learn Navajo. And I spent quite some time at that, but it's not a language I will ever be able to learn, I think. And one of the fascinations with what are called polysynthetic languages is that they don't really have a good analysis within minimalism. And it's because they are so focused on heads. And in minimalism, and that goes back to what used to be called X-bar theory, you have a balance between phrases and heads. So a phrase would be the nice computer, and a head would be an auxiliary. And so you balance that, and that's also important currently in Chomsky's the problem of projection. He says you can't put two phrases next to each other, and that's how you end up with that. Now, Native American languages are, in my opinion, organized differently, and that's one of the things I really want to figure out, and that's why perhaps they're represented in the book as well. So it isn't just easy languages, but those, I think, are a real challenge for current minimalism. Someone like Ken Hale did have an analysis, a tree structure of Navajo in a squib in linguistic inquiry. But if you look at it, the order of the morphemes is problematic and so on. So that was a bit of a digression, but yes. And I love looking at languages. I teach a typology class here, and even though I'm not a typologist, it's wonderful to puzzle what the aspect is. Is it aspect? Is it tense? Is there a mood involved? And so on.
In that respect, this work reminds me a bit of the sort of meso comparative, as opposed to macro or micro comparative work, the sort of work that's been done recently by people like Baker and also Longobardi
yes.
in the generative framework.
Yes, and I also talk, maybe not so much in this book, about the different types of cycles. So Bernd Heine, for instance, has recognized there are 3 types of cycles. And one is the really microcycle, that I now call microcycle, he didn't, where you're just looking at one word that changes. For instance, will becoming a future marker, or want currently becoming a future marker. I've seen work that says there are some people who can say it wanted to rain, meaning it is going to rain. So those are pretty standard, and they're smaller cycles. Then people look at the entire future system, for instance. Once will changes or once want changes. What happens to all of the tense and mood and aspect, the whole system? And then there are people who look at entire languages, how they go from isolating, and that means each word has its own meaning and there are no endings, to agglutinative language like Turkish, where you can still see the original words that are now glued together, to inflectional, where you can't see the boundaries between what used to be a word. And so people like Heine feel that you can't really think about macro cycles, we don't have the knowledge about that, and so on. So yes, in terms of comparative, these meso and micro and macro, it's very interesting work. Because one of the criticisms of the parameters approach was that we end up with too many parameters. If languages have to be differentiated in terms of Italian has a pro-drop parameter, English does not, we end up with so many choices. And if you can, in a way, put parameters in terms of, okay, I make a macro choice between polysynthetic or non, and then once I'm polysynthetic, I can make a choice between noun incorporation or not. So then that reduces the number of parameters. It presents a challenge because we then have to sort out what depends on what. So yes.
And then the task becomes to construct the sort of hierarchy that was proposed originally by Baker in Atoms of Language, but more recently has been advocated by people like Longobardi, Roberts Holmberg, and also in Chapter 9, I think it is, of your book.
Yes. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a challenge. So during Wickville, we were talking about that earlier, the West Coast Conference on Formal Linguistics. If you think about alignment types, whether languages are ergative or not, there are just so many possibilities in terms of whether person is relevant, whether it's past tense or not. And I didn't see those in some of the alignment hierarchies. It's such a challenge to get everything in. So yeah, that will be one of our challenges. The hierarchy I had was just in terms of case and agreement. And so I was saying, okay, does a language have case or not? Does it have agreement or not? And that then gives you a set for the features. So I was mainly concerned about features. So that helps me with thinking about that. Now, for most minimalists, all languages have agreement and case features, and I disagree with that. I think there are languages where case is not at all relevant, and among those would be, for instance, Navajo, where I don't think case is at all relevant because all the noun phrases are outside of the sentence, really. They're more like topics, and they're not integrated in the sentence. But that's my feeling. That's work by Elly van Gelderen, who in the 1980s came up with a macro parameter, in a sense, that said, are languages pronominal argument or not? And what that meant was that you had an affix on the verb, and did that count as an argument? So as a real, what in English would be a noun phrase outside of the verb.
One thing that keeps cropping up, both in the book and in your discussion, that I think is actually quite rare in historical syntax, is discussion of these native languages of the Americas. It really seems to be a unique selling point of what you're doing here. They're not usually used by diachronists, as I say, and do you think that there's scope for more work here?
Oh, definitely. I think I started looking at negation in the Athabascan languages. There are about 40 Athabascan languages. Greenberg thought about the languages of the Americas as having come in 3 waves across the Bering Seas, and certainly, and that's controversial, but most people are quite happy with having Athabascan or Na-Dene as one language group. They're one of the groups that came somewhat later from the first wave. And when I started looking at those 40 languages, I started noticing a real difference in the negation. So some of the the archaic languages are based more in Alaska. But as this language family began to branch out both to the east into Canada, and then to the southwest, to Navajo and Apache, as well as to the Pacific coast, they seemed to all change their negation in somewhat predictable ways. And you could also then start to look at what is an older form. And you really started to see that, for instance, there was an older L-type auxiliary that had been the negative auxiliary. And so that was still around in many of the languages and had been incorporated into the verb stem in some. Now, Navajo being one of the ones that had branched out maybe the furthest in the southwest, ended up not using that L at all, but ended up with a do and a da, and that also have interesting reflexes, cognates in the other languages. So I think started looking at a family like that doesn't have, where we don't know much about the diachrony, really makes you think, oh yes, we can do diachrony with languages, as long as you have a lot of dialects that have quite a bit of time depth from when they split up.
So it becomes a task of trying to figure out which are the more archaic variants and which are the more recent ones, a bit like looking at the rings in the trunk of a tree or something.
Yes. And I think you can, when you have 40 or so to compare, and I was only looking at negation, and these languages are actually quite stable in many of the other areas. And some speakers from, for instance, Canada can know the words for fish and water and so on. They're the same as the ones in Navajo. But their verb stems and the prefixes have remained remarkably stable. And that is perhaps one of the challenges for cyclical, for the cycle. Why is it that some languages and some constructions, negatives are fast. Negatives are somehow, it's important for us to make our point, whether it's yes or no, and therefore negatives change a lot. But there are some languages where things just remain stable. And Chinese, for instance, in Chinese the negatives have changed a lot. But for instance, there is very little that change in terms of the verb. There are no inflections very much that seem to be occurring. Perhaps at the moment there is a little bit about an aspect morpheme that seems to be weakening. But, it's a challenge why some languages move faster than others. And of course people have argued that there is pressure from other languages and that accelerates grammaticalization. So that is a possibility.
Jumping briefly back across the Atlantic, but still on a related note, perhaps some of your expertise in the American native languages influences your analysis of Old English in a sense, which you propose in Chapter 2 is at least partially polysynthetic.
Yes.
Which might surprise some more traditionally minded scholars. Could you say a bit about that?
Mm-hmm. So Old English was remarkably... One of the characteristics of polysynthetic languages is that you don't have very much embedding. So you don't say, I noticed that he left before she arrived or something like that. And so these languages, these sentences that aren't very embedded. So in Old English you have, then he went, then he did this, and then he did this. That's one of the characteristics. Another characteristic, and this is something you've worked on as well, that you could leave the pronoun unexpressed. Now, by the time of Old English, that is only, I think, some of your estimates are 20% where it could be unexpressed. But certainly that could mean that some of the inflection on the verb was actually interpretable, and the inflection on the verb is what made people interpret it as first or second person pronoun. And yeah, there are a couple of the quantifiers are missing, and that's another typical trait of polysynthetic languages. Reflexives weren't there, but that's a little bit harder to, because they probably were there in older versions. And yeah, so there was also a lot more expressed on the verb, and causatives and transitivizers, that all happened on the verb. So there was a lot more activity on the verb. And in that sense, they're similar to polysynthetic languages. If I really had to, if it was a big bet, I wouldn't know how to decide whether it's polysynthetic or not. In my book, I give a few arguments and sort of to make people think about this perhaps, and to think about what makes language polysynthetic or not. And that's really hard to know.
Another theme here of the book really is that some of these big picture terms that seem very intuitively useful, like synthetic, analytic, polysynthetic, kind of break down when you expose them to, when you compare different areas of the grammar, perhaps.
Yes.
So a point that I liked was that you kind of relativize the synthetic-analytic distinction to an extent to phenomena like tense, mood, and aspect, or negation.
Yes, and that again has to do with the micro and the macro, and maybe the meso cycles. Most people seem to be comfortable thinking about these changes at the level of the tense and so on, but not at the level of entire languages. The problem of what counts as synthetic or what counts as an analytic language has been a problem for a long time. Sapir thought about it, and, if a word has 3 morphemes, is that polysynthetic or not? So, yeah, I think we still don't have a really good answer to that.
Tense and aspects in your book are connected fairly closely with case. Could you explain that connection there?
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. And actually, so let's think about aspect. So aspect tells you whether an action is finished or not. So, and in English we don't have a very good perfective, that's aspect. That can also be expressed by means of a definite article. So if I say, I ate the apple is gone. If I say, I was eating an apple, or even more, I was eating of an apple, you're just eating a small part. So perfective has to do with whether the full apple was eaten, whether the verb was finished, so to speak. And you can do that by means of a perfective prefix, as in Russian. you can do it as in modern English by means of a definite article and an indefinite article. So what I found, and this is what other people have found also, is that once we lost the prefix in English that showed perfectivity, and that was the ge prefix, we got an increase almost immediately. Our demonstratives ended up becoming very frequent, so that and this and so on. And then they also grammaticalized to articles, the and later on. So as you lost the marking on the verb for perfectivity, you gained demonstratives. At the same time, you also lost the genitive on the noun. So you could say, I ate, and then the apple, and the apple would have, or apple would have genitive. And that would mean that it wasn't totally eaten. So it's really interesting to see how perfectivity can be expressed both in terms of case, in terms of aspect on the verb, but also as definite articles. And the work by Elisabeth Leijs has been very influential in terms of connecting aspect and case. So yeah, so there are a number of these really interesting changes happening in English around 1200. One of the other things I found is that as these changes were happening, you suddenly get the quantifier all a lot more. So all the so-and-so. So I think that was to emphasize that the perfectivity, that it was really finished.
So it's no longer playing a pure quantifier role?
Well, not in those texts. It was more indicating that it was finished. Actually, a student of mine in Arabic found that too, that there was, in order to indicate perfective aspect, you were using a quantifier. So I think there are a number, that's the interesting thing, again, about the cycle. What happens if you lose perfective aspect? If the ge prefix is lost, there will be a compensation in the system. Now, and another puzzle is that sometimes there is no compensation in the system. So, yeah, interesting questions that arise with that.
Mm. Most of your work is talking about the transition from semantic to syntactic in feature terms.
Mm-hmm.
So from semantic to interpretable to uninterpretable specifically. But one area where you don't find that, or where you don't state that you find it, is with the adverbs.
Yes, I figured you were going to ask that. Yes, adverbs are very problematic, and currently I'm looking at the same thing with the adjectives. I have a student that's working on how adjectives move up the tree, so to speak. So, for instance, an adjective like wooden originally just means a wooden desk or even a wooden nickel. They're wooden. But nowadays it's used as that is a wooden characterization, or that was a wooden performance or something like that. But so again, those sorts of changes are really hard to characterize in terms of features. And the same is true with adverbs. Something like clearly originally was something is done in a clear manner, and hopefully was originally I'm doing it in a hopeful manner. And now if I say hopefully this will happen, it's much more epistemic. I am expecting something, it's really hard to do that in terms of features, and I haven't really found a way to do that. Sometimes I feel that there are also huge jumps. These are jumps from an adverb that is modifying a verb to an adverb that's modifying a whole sentence. And it may be that it was the wrong way of looking at those changes in terms of grammaticalization. Maybe these are lexicalizations, and the adverb at the end of a sentence is connected more with the next sentence, so there's a jump from the one sentence to the other. I'm not sure, but I'm more doubtful about that analysis. So you're absolutely right.
And that touches on another issue that's raised within the book. At one point, you discussed two competing analyses of pronominal argument languages, Baker's analysis and Jelinek's analysis. And you end up concluding, if this is a fair characterization, that you adopt Jelinek's analysis because actually it seems to fit better diachronically.
Yes.
This use of essentially diachronic argumentation to decide between two competing synchronic analyses is quite interesting. Do you think there's scope for more of that in minimalism?
Mm-hmm. So in the case of the pronominal argument languages, Baker, if I remember correctly, uses a pro and Jelinek does not. And it's just in terms of the increase in polysynthesis, which has happened in Navajo, for instance. It's that languages has objects obligatorily marked on the verb as well, whereas other languages do not, and we know that's a change. So it made more sense. If one had certain economy principles, it was easier to describe it in terms of Jelinek's system. So yes, some of the changes give us insight into the analysis as well. So diachrony can help our theories and our frameworks. And that often has been a problem, and this is something I've talked about before in papers, that the generative enterprise, even though there were people like Klima and Kiparsky and King, quite early on, these people were interested in generative historical linguistics. Chomsky has never really been very interested in historical linguistics, partly because of his emphasis on the native speaker and native speaker judgments. So I do think historical change can really help our frameworks. And part of that is if change is always in a particular direction, showing particular characteristics, this means that the child is reorganizing things in a particular way. And that's what we're interested in. What is the faculty of language? What does a child and what do we have in our heads? And so, yes, I think it's crucial to look at linguistic change.
One possible difficulty with working with the Minimalist Program as a framework for doing diachronic analyses might be that it's a bit of a moving target. So, for instance, you proposed two specific principles as part of feature economy, the late merge principle and the head preference principle. And as for the late merge principle, that's something that in recent work Chomsky has been arguing may not follow. And as for the head preference principle, which says be a head rather than a phrase, be a head rather than a specifier, essentially, that might cause issues with the people who are now arguing that specifiers don't exist. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering what your experience is with that. Do you find it frustrating? Do you enjoy the challenge?
Well, I've been around a long time to see that certain things aren't going to go away. Like there are many languages where when the subject comes before the verb, the agreement is very different, Arabic for instance, than when the verb comes before the subject. And this receives a perfect account in a spec head versus a probe analysis. And, okay, so now suddenly we don't have specifiers anymore. We don't have spec head agreement anymore. So then the data aren't going to go away. So, we still have to find a solution for those differences. And so, yeah, sometimes it's frustrating, but I also know that most of the time where I was really resistant to a particular thing, later on I came to appreciate why it is this way. And for instance, Keynes, linear correspondence axiom a lot of people were initially very reluctant about, and now we're, by accepting it but also criticizing it then and saying, why can't it be, why does the tree always have to go one direction? Why couldn't it go in the other direction? And nowadays people are thinking about that, and it has made us think about precedents in a different way and sort of proceeding versus following. And so I think it's good to rethink a particular problem. Now, in the case of the late merge principle, and the late merge principle basically says if you're moving around too much, that's costly. I think, even though Chomsky says, well, it's not that costly, we still need to think about some of these issues, that there is a difference between what is now called internal and external merge. So I still think we need to pay attention to that.
So whatever the theory is doing, there are still generalizations there that need to be captured.
Yeah, that's a very good way of saying it.
Great, okay. You mentioned Kane there towards the end. Word order change is something that gets touched on towards the very end of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And your conclusions there aren't very positive, ultimately.
No, I think it's really hard to figure out why changes happen. So SOV to SVO is the one we're probably the most familiar with, and that's the change between Latin and the more modern Romance languages, and also the change between Old English and Modern English. But so what are some of the other changes that can happen? There aren't that many. The ones in the book on page 363, I see SVO going to SOV, but that's not as frequent. VSO to SVO, that's because the verb stops moving. What frustrates me maybe in this is that there are changes you would expect to see happen. For instance, from VSO to SVO, because that's a VSO language is one where the verb moves in front of the S. And so you would expect the verb to stop moving and that sort of thing. When I looked at this, and I looked at it probably several months, and it was also hard to find the data. You would think there's a lot on changes in word order, but it was hard to find that.
So some people have argued, have made quite strong claims on the basis of word order change. For instance, a recent paper by Gelman and Rulin saying that, proto-worlds was probably OV because generally OV changes to VO. Do you think that's over-optimistic given the current state of our knowledge?
You would also need to know a number of other things. So OV to VO usually, in the changes we know, it usually happens more with certain definite objects and not, for instance, with negative indefinites. They stay OV the longest, so you would need to know. And I don't know that paper, actually. I should take a look at that. But so you expect certain things. You expect a rationale. And it won't change, of course, from one day to the next. So the stages in between will give you insight as to whether that is, in fact, the right analysis or not.
So again, it's important to look at the details as well as the very broad brush picture.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we're running short on time, so my final question to you is, now that this book is on the shelves, though it's now been on the shelves for a year and then some, but now that it's out there on the shelves, what are you working on at the moment, and what are your future research plans?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm still fascinated by cycle, so I'm still finding new examples. At the moment, I'm looking at the dual and what happened to the dual and so on, and whether I can see that as a cycle. I'm also doing the proofs for a syntax textbook that's coming out with Cambridge in July, so that will be nice to have that out. And that's a book that looks at the three layers of a clause, so it looks at the CP, the TP, and the VP layer, and both in a cartographic and in a minimalist approach. sort of what are the tensions between these two frameworks or ways of looking at it. But then I think my major project, possibly a book project, is looking at argument structure and looking at how a verb has a more special relationship with its theme than with all the other arguments. And so a theme would be, I eat an apple. The apple is the theme and the I is the agent. And so the reason for, and there's been a lot of debate recently whether verbs are in the lexicon with all their arguments specified. So give would have an agent, a theme, and a recipient. Whether they are all in the lexicon that way, or whether a verb is just a root and you just add arguments as you want. And my feeling on that is that it's more in between, so that the verb is in the lexicon with its theme, but that the other ones can be added. And my reason for arguing that is, again, Native American languages that have suppletive stems for what kind of thing you eat, for instance, or what kind of things you handle. There are about 9 different stems. And children start, and this is work by a PhD student of mine who looked at that for Spanish, John Ryan, and he found that children start, even in one word utterances, they say things like up and fall. And so the theme seems to be pretty basic. And I've also looked at that in terms of linguistic change, how themes change, and they seem to like to be close to the verb. If a theme is higher up, as in the case of object experiencers, like this surprises me, there's often a reanalysis, a reshuffle of the theme. So that's one of an interest that has just started to gel a little bit. So the theme and how it has a different relationship to the verb than the other arguments.
Great. Well, I look forward to the results of that one coming out. And in the meantime, I will just say thank you very much for your time today.
And thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I've been talking to Elly van Gelderen about her book, The Linguistic Cycle. This is George Walkden for New Books in Language saying thank you for listening.